I want you to picture a salute. October 25th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. A Japanese warship is cutting through the water. Her captain walks out onto the exposed wing of his bridge. He looks across the water at what is directly in front of him. It is an American destroyer, or what used to be one. She is on fire from stem to stern. Her hull has been penetrated by more shells than anyone has counted. Her guns are silent because there is no ammunition left. She is listing hard to starboard and sinking. Men are in the water around her. The Japanese captain stops. He stands at rigid, formal attention. He raises his hand to his cap, and he salutes the sinking American ship, a Japanese naval officer in the middle of a battle, rendering full military honors to a dying enemy vessel. The men in the water watched it happen. They never forgot it. For that to make sense, for you to understand why a battle-hardened Japanese captain stopped everything to salute a burning, sinking, almost completely destroyed American tin can, you need to understand what that ship did in the 3 hours before she went down. You need to understand what one man decided to do when the largest, most heavily armed fleet in the history of naval warfare appeared on the horizon. And you need to understand that he had, at that moment, exactly one option available to him. He could run. He chose something else entirely. Ernest Edwin Evans was born in 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma. His blood was Cherokee and Creek on both sides. He grew up in the specific world of early 20th century Oklahoma, a state that had been carved out of territory, taken from the tribes that Evans descended from, a place where the specific transaction of that history was still close enough to be felt in the daily texture of life. He was not a large man. Medium height, medium build. Nothing about his physical presence suggested what he would become. What he had, from very early on, was a quality that people who knew him described consistently and in remarkably similar language: an absolute, structural inability to back down from anything. Not aggression, not recklessness, something more precise. A specific refusal to accept any situation as fixed when he judged that it needed to change. He attended the United States Naval Academy and graduated in 1931. The Navy of the early 1930s was a peacetime institution, reduced by budget cuts and operating in the long shadow of a war that everyone hoped would be the last one. Evans served through the lean years, destroyer duty, the slow climb of a career officer, the patient accumulation of skill and seniority. He was good at his job, reliably good, the kind of officer whose fitness reports noted his competence without quite finding the language to describe what set him apart. What set him apart would not become visible until there was a situation large enough to require it. That situation was coming. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war Evans had been preparing for, in his own way, on his own terms, his entire career. He was 33 years old. He had been a naval officer for 10 years. He understood the machinery of war at sea, the way a craftsman understands his tools, not just what they do, but what they can be made to do when handled correctly. He also understood something that not every officer in the United States Navy had fully absorbed by December of 1941. The enemy was serious. In October of 1943, Evans was given command of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer newly commissioned, fresh from the yards, 2,100 tons of high-speed steel, armed with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. On the day he took command, he assembled his crew on the deck and made them a promise. He said, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now, because I will never retreat from a fight. Not one man left the deck. They had no idea, on that October afternoon, how precisely and completely Evans would keep that promise. To understand what happened on October 25th, 1944, you first need to understand what the Japanese had built. The Yamato. She was laid down in 1937 and completed in 1941, and she was, without any qualification or caveat, the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever constructed by any nation in the history of naval warfare. 72,000 tons fully loaded, 860 feet long. Her steel armor belt at the waterline was 16 inches thick, the equivalent of a solid wall of compressed steel, nearly as wide as a man's forearm is long. Her main battery consisted of 9 18-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, the largest naval artillery ever put to sea. A single armor-piercing shell from those guns weighed 3,200 pounds, as much as a standard automobile, fired at a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second, with an effective range of over 25 miles. From 25 miles away, the Yamato could put a 3,000-pound shell through the deck of any ship in the American Navy. She was not a weapon. She was a philosophy. The Japanese belief that one ship of sufficient size and firepower could simply negate the entire calculus of naval warfare. One ship that nothing could sink, that nothing could approach, that could stand in the center of the ocean and destroy everything within range. She had never been seriously challenged. She was about to meet the USS Johnston. But the Yamato was not alone. The Japanese plan, codenamed Shoichigo, Victory Operation Number 1, was the largest and most complex naval engagement Japan had ever attempted. They were committing everything they had left to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The center force that would approach through the San Bernardino Strait consisted of 4 battleships, including the Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 23 warships. Combined displacement approaching 400,000 tons. This fleet had been kept secret. American naval intelligence believed it was still in port. Admiral Halsey, commanding the main American battle fleet, had been successfully lured away to the north by a Japanese decoy force. The San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. At 3 in the morning on October 25th, the center force came through. Taffy 3, that was the radio call sign. Task Unit 77.4.3. The unit assigned to provide air support for the ground troops landing at Leyte and to hunt enemy submarines in the surrounding waters. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded it from the bridge of the escort carrier, Fanshawe Bay. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, essentially merchant hulls with wooden flight decks bolted on, capable of a maximum speed of 17 knots, and 7 screening ships, 3 destroyers, including the Johnston, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. I want you to understand what an escort carrier was, because the name sounds more impressive than the reality. These were not fleet carriers. They were not designed for fleet combat. They were small, around 500 feet long, around 11,000 tons. And they had been built fast and cheap because the war needed air coverage everywhere at once, and there were not enough fleet carriers to provide it. Their hulls were merchant-grade steel. Their flight decks were wooden planking. Their maximum speed was slower than a fleet destroyer, running at half power. They carried aircraft loaded for the missions they were actually assigned: anti-submarine patrols, close air support for ground troops, depth charges. high explosive fragmentation bombs meant for hitting infantry in the open, not armor-piercing weapons capable of penetrating battleship deck armor. Their own defensive armament was minimal. Each escort carrier had one 5-inch gun mounted at the stern, one gun facing backward, on a ship that could not outrun anything the Japanese Navy had in the water. The destroyers, the Johnston, the Hole, the Hairman, were the screen. Their job was to protect the carriers from submarines and light surface threats. A Fletcher-class destroyer, like the Johnston, was armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. Against a submarine, this was more than adequate. Against a coastal patrol vessel or a light cruiser, a well-handled destroyer could cause serious problems. Against a battleship armed with 18-inch guns, a 5-inch shell was the naval equivalent of throwing a stone at a tank. The Johnston's entire broadside, all 5 guns firing simultaneously, delivered less explosive energy than a single secondary battery shell from the Yamato. The math was not complicated. If the center force found Taffy Three would cease to exist. October 25th, 1944, 0645. The sun is coming up over the Philippine Sea. The morning is clear and relatively calm. The pilots of Taffy Three are eating breakfast and preparing for the day's routine patrols. The escort carriers are steaming in their standard formation, relaxed, unhurried. There is nothing on the radar. A Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber on anti-submarine patrol is making lazy circles north of the formation. The pilot is checking the water below for periscope feathers, the specific pattern of disturbed water that indicates a submarine near the surface. He sees something else. He banks his aircraft lower. He sees more. His voice, when he keys the radio, is cracking. He tells the fleet below him that he is looking at the center force: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. The horizon to the north is painted in warship silhouettes for as far as he can see. Admiral Sprague on the Fanshawe Bay hears the report and does not believe it. He tells the pilot to check his identification. The Third Fleet is supposed to be covering the strait. These must be American ships. The pilot banks his Avenger directly over the fleet at low altitude. He flies close enough to read the flag. He tells the fleet, "I can see the biggest meatball flags on the biggest battleships I ever saw. They are shooting at me." At 6:58 in the morning, the Yamato's main battery fires. The shells travel 22 miles before landing. The flight time is nearly 30 seconds, long enough for the men on the American ships to see the orange flashes on the horizon and stand watching, unable to fully process what they were seeing. Before the impacts arrived, the water around the escort carriers erupted in colored pillars: pink, green, red. The Japanese used dye-marked shells, so each battleship could distinguish its own shell splashes. To the men on the American wooden-decked carriers, it looked like the ocean was bleeding in colors. The killing had begun. Sprague did 3 things in the first 60 seconds. He turned the entire formation east, toward a rain squall on the horizon, trying to put distance and weather between his ships and the incoming fire. He ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to make smoke, to generate the dense black chemical smoke screens that could hide the carriers from the optical rangefinders the Japanese ships were using for targeting. And he got on the radio and transmitted in the clear to anyone who could hear him: "We are being attacked by a major Japanese force, including battleships and heavy cruisers. Request immediate assistance." He knew, even as he sent it, that the nearest help was hours away. Taffy Three was alone. On the bridge of the Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans watched the colored shell splashes walk toward the escort carriers. He understood the mathematics precisely. The Japanese ships were faster. They had far greater range. The carriers could not escape. The smoke screens would buy time, but not enough. If Taffy Three simply ran, the Japanese would close the distance systematically and destroy the carriers one at a time from behind, outside the range of anything the Americans had that could fight back. The only way to stop that from happening was to make the Japanese stop chasing. The only way to make them stop chasing was to threaten them with something they had to respond to. Evans had 10 torpedoes. He did not ask for permission. He did not radio Admiral Sprague. He did not consult his executive officer or wait for orders to come down the chain of command. He made a decision on his own authority, in the moment, with full understanding of what it meant. He turned the Johnston out of formation. He ordered flank speed, maximum engine power, every pound of steam the boilers could produce. He pointed the bow of his 2,100-ton unarmored destroyer directly at the center force. He was going to attack. The distance was 18,000 yards, roughly 10 miles. At flank speed, the Johnston could cover it in perhaps 20 minutes. 20 minutes of running directly into the fire of 23 Japanese warships while they shot at a single small target with everything they had. The Japanese gunners had never seen anything like it. Through their rangefinders, they watched a single American destroyer charging their formation at full speed. The tactical assumption, the only logical tactical assumption, was that this was the leading edge of a much larger force, that a full destroyer squadron was behind it, or that it was marking a torpedo attack pattern from multiple directions. No single ship would charge a fleet alone. It simply was not done. Evans was doing it. The ocean around the Johnston became a vertical landscape of white water. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo, 8-inch shells from the heavy cruisers. The shell splashes rose 40, 50, 60 feet into the air, and the Johnston drove through them at 30 knots, her helmsman throwing the wheel left and right in the pattern Evans called out. Not a random zigzag, but a calculated series of turns designed to make the firing solution constantly incorrect. The noise inside the ship was beyond loud. It was physical, a continuous percussion that the men felt in their chests and their teeth and behind their eyes. Evans stood on the bridge and watched the water explode around him and kept calling the turns. He needed to get within 5 miles. 5 miles was torpedo range. Against all probability, the Johnston reached 5 miles. Evans picked his target. Not a destroyer, not a light cruiser. He locked onto the Yamato, a Takao-class heavy cruiser, 13,000 tons, 8 8-inch guns, one of the most powerful warships in the center force. He fired all 10 torpedoes. The Mark 15 torpedoes hit the water and began their run. They were not guided. Once fired, they ran straight at the set depth and detonation distance. Evans threw the Johnston into a hard turn immediately after firing, generating a thick smoke curtain to cover the withdrawal, and watched his stopwatch. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. 3 explosions. 3 torpedoes found the Yamato. The detonations blew her entire bow section off the ship. 13,000 tons of warship came to a sudden, violent stop. She was finished, not sunk, but crippled, flooding forward, completely combat ineffective, out of the battle. A 2,100-ton American destroyer had just removed the Yamato from the fight with weapons that were not supposed to be capable of threatening a vessel that size. The Johnston slipped into the rain squall to reload and assess damage. She had been extraordinarily lucky so far. That luck was about to run out, At 7:30 in the morning, three 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo found the Johnston. The first shell punched through the main engine room and detonated inside the ship. The explosion killed dozens of men instantly, shredded the main steam lines, and dropped the Johnston's speed from 30 knots to 15. The second and third shells hit the bridge area. The blast was confined and catastrophic. Metal moving at high velocity in a sealed space, shrapnel filling every cubic inch of enclosed volume. Evans was thrown off his feet and into the bulkhead. He stood up. 2 fingers on his left hand were gone, removed by flying shrapnel. He was bleeding from his chest and both arms. His shirt had been blown off his body by the concussive force. He looked at what was left of his hand. He wrapped a piece of cloth around it. He walked back to the helm. The steering system was destroyed. The rudder would not respond. Evans found the hatch leading down to the manual steering compartment, a dark space below the waterline where the rudder linkage could be operated by hand. He kicked it open. He leaned in and shouted steering commands down into the darkness, and the men below, working by feel in a space filled with smoke and the sound of water pressing against a damaged hull, began turning the rudder by brute force. The Johnston was now half speed, manually steered, her radar and fire control destroyed, 2 of her 5 guns out of action, her captain bleeding from multiple wounds and standing at an open hatch in the deck screaming directions down into a hole. She was still fighting. For the next hour, Evans did something that has no precise tactical name in any naval doctrine manual. He interposed. Every time a Japanese cruiser or battleship moved to close the distance to the escort carriers, Evans put the Johnston between them. He fired his remaining 3 5-inch guns, manually aimed because the fire control was gone, at ranges where a 5-inch shell could not meaningfully damage a heavy cruiser or battleship, but where the volume and accuracy of the fire was enough to force the Japanese to respond, to redirect their attention, to break their targeting solution on the carriers. The Japanese commanders, observing the Johnston through optical range finders from their heavily armored bridges, were forming an incorrect conclusion. A ship that small, firing with that rate and accuracy and aggression, refusing to retreat, repositioning continuously to maintain an offensive threat. It could not be a destroyer. It must be a heavy cruiser. It must have armor and firepower they were not yet seeing. There must be a larger American force somewhere behind it, and this was the screen. This was the specific confusion that Evans was creating, not with strength, but with behavior. He was making the Johnston look like something it was not by acting like something it was not. The carriers ran. The Johnston bought them time to run. Inside the Johnston, the conditions were those of a ship that had already absorbed fatal damage and refused to acknowledge it. The engine room was full of steam from ruptured lines. Men were working in it. The gun crews were loading shells by hand into breeches that had to be operated manually because the power rammers were gone. The decks were covered in brass casings, blood, water from the shell splashes that had washed over the sides, and the debris of a ship that had been hit multiple times by weapons designed to sink things much larger than itself. There was no panic, not because the men were not afraid. They were, but because there was no time for panic. There was only the next task, and the one after that, and Evans's voice, coming through whatever communications still worked, telling them what to do. Then a new threat emerged from the smoke. A Japanese destroyer squadron, the light cruiser Yahagi and several fleet destroyers, had moved into position to launch a massed torpedo spread at the escort carriers. If those torpedoes ran true, the carriers were finished. Wooden decks, no armor, no chance. Evans assessed the situation. His ship was half speed, manually steered, critically damaged. He had 3 working guns and no torpedoes. He turned the Johnston toward the Japanese squadron. He had nothing left to fight them with, except the one thing he had always had. The Johnston charged the destroyer squadron alone. She came out of the smoke at 15 knots, her maximum remaining speed, firing all 3 guns as fast as the crews could load them. The volume of fire was not enough to destroy a warship. It was enough to be terrifying, enough to create the specific psychological sensation in the bridge of every Japanese ship in that squadron, of being attacked by something that had no business still being alive and was attacking anyway. The Japanese squadron commander hesitated. He turned his ships. He fired his torpedoes early, from a range and angle where they could not reach the carriers. They ran out of fuel and sank harmlessly. The carriers survived. The Johnston had saved them with 3 guns and an empty torpedo rack and a 15-knot charge into a squadron that outgunned her by a factor of 10. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the Johnston had been in continuous combat for over 2 hours. She had taken hits that would have finished most ships in the first 15 minutes. She had been slowed to half speed, lost her steering, lost half her guns, lost dozens of her crew. She was on fire in multiple compartments. She was listing. And still, Evans was maneuvering her between the Japanese ships and the American carriers. The end came at 9:45. The Johnston was completely surrounded. She had sailed too far into the formation in her final charge, and the Japanese ships had closed around her on all sides. There was no direction she could turn. That was not into the fire of another warship. The last 3 guns fell silent, not because the crews abandoned them, because there was no ammunition left to fire. Evans looked at what was left of his ship. Out of 327 men, 186 were dead or missing. The survivors were keeping the Johnston afloat through effort and will, manually controlling systems that had no business still functioning, doing things that the ship's designers had not anticipated, because nobody had anticipated that a ship would still be trying to fight in this condition. He gave the order that every captain hopes never to give. Abandon ship. The men went into the water. They looked back at the Johnston. She was still afloat, still listing, still burning, settling slowly into the Philippine Sea with the specific deliberateness of something very heavy that is going somewhere it cannot return from. Here is what happened next. I want you to understand the context before I tell you, because without the context, it sounds invented. It sounds like the kind of thing that gets added to stories later because it makes them better. It is not invented. It is documented by multiple survivors who were in the water watching when it happened. A Japanese destroyer broke from the formation and approached the sinking Johnston at speed. The American survivors in the water assumed they understood what was coming. The Imperial Japanese Navy had a reputation in this war that was specific and documented. Men in the water were not always treated as men. The survivors prepared themselves for what they expected. The Japanese destroyer slowed. She came alongside the Johnston at low speed. The captain walked out onto the exposed wing of his bridge. He looked at the Johnston. He stood at rigid, formal attention. He raised his hand to his cap. He saluted. A full, formal, military salute, rendered to a sinking enemy vessel, rendered in the middle of a battle that was still ongoing, rendered by a man whose navy had been fighting the Johnston's navy for 3 years, and who had watched, from his bridge, what the Johnston had done in the past 3 hours. Then the Japanese destroyer moved on. We do not know the captain's name. The records do not tell us which specific vessel it was. He is anonymous in the historical record. A silhouette on a bridge wing, a raised hand, an act of recognition that nobody asked him to perform, and that had no military utility whatsoever. He did it because some things require acknowledgement regardless of which side you are on. What he was acknowledging was this: a ship that should not have fought chose to fight. A ship that should have run chose to charge. A ship that should have died in the first 5 minutes lasted 3 hours and changed the outcome of a battle that changed the course of a campaign, that changed the course of the war. He saw it. He said so in the only language available to him in that moment. The Johnston sank at 10:10 in the morning. She took the Philippine Sea at roughly a 20-degree list, settling bow first, going under with what survivors described as a strange and specific slowness, as if even the act of sinking was something the ship was resisting. Commander Ernest was last seen near the stern, helping men over the side. He was never found. Here is what the battle cost. The Johnston lost 186 dead of her crew of 327. The Hull, the second destroyer that had followed Evans into the fight, lost 253 dead of her crew of 312. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer, escort a fraction of the Johnston size, that had followed the destroyers into the charge, lost 89 dead. The escort carrier, Gambier Bay, sunk by Japanese gunfire during the battle, 143 dead. In the water after the battle, the survivors floated for nearly 2 days before rescue came. 2 days in the Philippine Sea, in waters that had every reason to be hostile, waiting for ships that the chaos of the battle made slow to arrive. Of the Johnston's 141 survivors who went into the water, only 140 were recovered alive. 1 man died in the water within sight of rescue. Here is what the battle saved. The center force turned around, not because it was defeated, not because it had been destroyed or significantly damaged, because the men commanding it, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita on the bridge of the Yamato, became convinced over the 3 hours of fighting that they were engaging not a handful of escort ships, but a full American fleet with fleet carriers and cruisers. The smoke screens and the aggressive destroyer charges had created an impression of scale and power that did not exist. Kurita could not see through the smoke to count what he was actually fighting. What he could see was a battle that was not going the way the planning had predicted. Ships attacking when they should be running. Aircraft pressing attacks when they should be withdrawing. Behavior that did not fit the model of a weak escort unit. He ordered the center force to withdraw at 12:36. The Yamato turned around and went back through the San Bernardino Strait. The landing force at Leyte Gulf survived. 67,000 American soldiers who were on the beaches or still aboard transport ships when the Japanese center force appeared on the horizon survived because Taffy Three held General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The campaign that would ultimately result in the liberation of the Philippines and the isolation of the Japanese home islands continued. The strategic trajectory of the Pacific War, which had been hanging for 3 hours on the question of whether a handful of tin cans could hold a line they had no business holding, continued in the direction it had been going. None of that was guaranteed at 6:45 in the morning on October 25th. Commander Ernest was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation reads, in part, through his valiant fighting spirit and daring tactics, Evans inspired his men to fight with exceptional valor against overwhelming odds, thereby contributing materially to the final rout of a powerful Japanese force and upholding the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. That is the formal language. The informal language, the language of the men who were in the water, the men who watched him through the smoke, the men who served under him, was different. They said, he never retreated from a fight. There is a detail from the battle that I've not been able to stop thinking about since I first researched it. At some point during the middle of the engagement, the records are not precise about exactly when, an enlisted man on the Johnston ran from one of the damaged gun mounts to Evans on the bridge to report that his mount was out of action and ask for orders. Evans turned to him and said, "Use your best judgment." Then he turned back to the battle. Use your best judgment. Not a complex order, not a doctrine reference, not a citation to the relevant naval regulation. Just the specific, profound trust of a commanding officer who had trained his crew to the point where he could say those 4 words in the middle of the worst battle of their lives and mean them completely. The man went back to his gun mount. He found something else he could do with it. He did it. Evans was 36 years old when the Johnston went down. He had been a naval officer for 13 years. He had taken command of the Johnston exactly 1 year and 12 days before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In that year, he had trained his crew, sailed his ship across the Pacific, participated in multiple operations, and built the specific culture of a fighting ship. The culture he had announced on the day he took command. The culture that produced men who could fight the way they fought on October 25th. 1 year. From commissioning to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese never published a formal account of what Kurita saw through the smoke that morning. He was questioned after the war by American naval historians and gave several accounts that were partially contradictory. The specific unreliability of memory, trying to reconstruct a day that had been chaotic even at the time. But the core of what happened is not in dispute. He thought he was fighting something much larger than he was. He was wrong. He was fighting 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, supported by aircraft armed for anti-submarine work. He turned around anyway. The survivors of Taffy Three were not publicly celebrated in the immediate aftermath of the battle. The engagement at Leyte Gulf was complex, and the American performance was mixed. Halsey's decision to chase the Japanese decoy fleet north had left the strait unguarded and nearly led to a catastrophe. The Navy had reasons to be quiet about some aspects of what had happened. The men of Taffy Three came home, were discharged, and went back to their lives. Some of them talked about it. Many of them didn't. The men who had been on the Johnston in particular tended towards silence on the subject, in the way that people are silent about things that happened on a scale they cannot reduce to ordinary language. Bob Hagen, the Johnston's gunnery officer, survived the battle and the 2 days in the water and the war. He spent decades afterward gathering accounts from other survivors, cross-referencing them against Japanese records released after the occupation, building the most complete picture available of what had actually happened in those 3 hours. He said, in an interview late in his life, "I don't think any of us ever fully believed it happened. Not the way it happened. Even the men who were there. The wreck of the USS Johnston was found in 2021. She is at the bottom of the Philippine Sea in 21,000 feet of water, the deepest shipwreck ever located and explored by a remotely operated vehicle at that time. She lies on her side. broken in two sections, her guns still in their mounts. The number 557, her hull number, visible on what remains of her bow. She went down in water so deep that she will never be raised. She is a war grave. Robert Billy was a Cherokee elder who had known Evans' family. After the war, he was asked to speak at a memorial for Evans in Pawnee, Oklahoma. He said, Evans fought the way the old warriors fought, not because he thought he could win, because it was the right fight to make. That is not a naval doctrine formulation. It is not in the Medal of Honor citation. It is the specific understanding of a man from a specific culture, describing what he recognized in one of his own, because it was the right fight to make. I want to go back to the salute, because it is the detail that this story keeps returning to. The detail that you cannot explain away with tactics or doctrine or the logic of military necessity. A Japanese captain stopped in the middle of a battle to acknowledge what the Johnston had done, not what the Johnston had accomplished, not the tactical outcome, what the ship had done, the specific quality of the fighting, the refusal to stop, the 3 hours of interposing between things much larger than herself and the things she was trying to protect. He recognized it, he honored it, and the men floating in the water around the sinking ship watched it happen, and they remembered it for the rest of their lives because it confirmed something they already knew and needed to have confirmed. What they had done was worth doing. Evans had a policy on the Johnston that some of his officers found unusual. He shared information. Not just orders, not just need to know. He told his crew what was happening, where they were going, what the mission was, what the risks were. He believed that men who understood the situation could respond to it correctly when circumstances changed, and he could no longer give them orders. Use your best judgment. This was not a slogan. It was the result of a deliberate, sustained investment in his crew. He was building something, a ship full of men who could function without him when they had to. On October 25th, they did. Here is what the Johnston was. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,100 tons, 340 feet long, designed, built, and crewed to escort carriers, hunt submarines, and screen against light surface threats. She was not designed for what she did on October 25th, 1944. Nothing was designed for that. There is no doctrine manual that covers what Evans ordered that morning. No tactical framework that produces a scenario where a 2,000-ton tin can charge as a fleet that displaces 400,000 tons. What the Johnston was, in the end, was what Evans made her. A crew that had been told from the first day that they were a fighting ship, that they would go in harm's way, that they would not retreat. A crew that believed it. On the morning of October 25th, with the Yamato's shells turning the ocean into colored geysers around them, with the mathematics of the situation clear and unambiguous and terrible, that crew did what they had been built to do. They went toward it. The Japanese captain on the bridge wing had no way of knowing, when he raised his hand, that he was saluting not just a ship, but a decision made on a dock in Seattle in October of 1943 by a Cherokee naval officer from Pawnee, Oklahoma, who told his crew what kind of ship they were and meant every word of it. The decision held. All the way to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, all the way down to 21,000 feet, where she still lies on her side in the dark, her guns in their mounts, her hull number still readable on her bow. Too far down to raise, not possible to forget.